What happens when a kingdom is built on a lie, its foundations mortared with deceit and ambition? What happens when the only person who can see the cracks forming is the one person no one would ever see? A waitress, a ghost in the grand theater of power, polishing silver while dynasties plot their own demise. This is the story of a whispered warning that brought an empire to its knees, of a king betrayed by the one he held closest, and of the ordinary woman who held the fate of a throne on a slip of paper. She was just a waitress named Anna, but in a world of wolves, her quiet observation was the most dangerous weapon of all. She overheard the plot, a venomous whisper in a room of clinking glasses and false laughter. A plan to assassinate the Alpha King during the treaty dinner. With only seconds to act, she scribbled a message, a desperate anonymous plea, and slipped it into the king's napkin. "Your queen sold you out. Go now." That single sentence was a lit match dropped into a reservoir of gasoline, and the world was about to burn. Anna didn't know if he'd read it, if he'd believe it, or if her life was now forfeit. All she knew was that silence was a betrayal she could not live with. The air in Ethelgard's was a carefully curated symphony of hushed wealth, a low hum of conversation layered over the delicate chime of crystal and the scrape of silver on porcelain. Anna moved through it all like a shadow, her presence designed to be felt but not seen. Her black uniform was a void against the restaurant's opulent tapestry of mahogany, gold leaf, and deep crimson velvet. She was an expert in invisibility, a skill honed over years of serving the city's elite, the ones who saw service staff as functional furniture. She saw everything. She noticed the tremor in a CEO's hand as he signed a ruinous deal, the flicker of contempt in a wife's eyes as her husband toasted their anniversary, the subtle language of feet tapping and fingers drumming that spoke a truer story than the carefully composed faces above the table. Tonight, the air was different. It was not just thick with money and ambition. It was electric with something primal, something dangerous. The reservation had come under a pseudonym, but the entire staff knew who was coming. King Lycan, the alpha of all alphas, ruler of the continent's 7 werewolf packs. He was more myth than man, a figure of terrifying power, spoken of in whispers. When he arrived, the low hum of the restaurant did not cease, but its pitch changed. It became tighter, strained. He was a predator in a room of well-fed sheep, and everyone felt it in their bones. He was larger than any man Anna had ever seen, his presence consuming the space around him. He wore a bespoke suit that seemed barely capable of containing the raw strength of his frame. His eyes, the color of molten gold, swept the room once, a silent, absolute assessment of every soul present. Beside him was Queen Seraphina, a vision of curated perfection. Her beauty was architectural, all sharp angles and flawless lines, her silver gown shimmering like a second skin. She smiled, a dazzling, empty gesture that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. Anna was assigned to their table. Her hands were steady as she poured the vintage Bordeaux, her movements economical and precise. She kept her eyes downcast, a mask of professional deference firmly in place. But behind the mask, she was observing, absorbing. She noted the way the king's hand rested on the small of the queen's back, a gesture of possession that seemed to lack any real warmth. She saw the way Seraphina's smile tightened for a fraction of a second when his touch lingered. It was a crack, a tiny fissure in the perfect facade. The conversation at the royal table was sparse. a series of polite, meaningless inquiries. But the real conversation was happening elsewhere. At a nearby table, Lord Vorlag, the notoriously volatile alpha of the Northern Ridge Pack, was dining with two of his retainers. He was ostensibly there to sign a treaty with King Lycan, a public display of unity. But Anna watched him watch the Queen, and she watched the Queen watch him back. It was a glance, nothing more, a fleeting connection across the crowded room. But in it, Anna saw a shared secret, a silent affirmation. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of reading the unsaid, screamed that something was wrong. She continued her duties, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, her path a silent looping orbit around the nexus of power at the center of the room. It was during one of these orbits, as she paused behind a large decorative pillar to allow another server to pass, that she heard it. The whisper was barely audible over the clatter of the kitchen and the murmur of the dining room. It came from Vorlag's table. He had leaned close to one of his men, his back to the room, believing himself to be concealed. But sound, like light, can bend around corners. "The moment the treaty is signed," Vorlag hissed, his voice a low, venomous rumble, "the poison in the ceremonial pen will be instantaneous. Serafina has ensured his personal guard is compromised. They will not intervene. By the time he hits the floor, the crown is ours." Anna's blood turned to ice, her breath caught in her throat, a painful, sharp thing. She felt the tray in her hand tremble, the glasses on it threatening to rattle. She forced herself to remain still, a statue carved from terror. It couldn't be real. A plot so audacious, so treacherous, unfolding right here in a room full of witnesses. The Queen, his own Queen. The words echoed in her mind. Serafina has ensured his personal guard is compromised. She looked at the royal table. King Lycan was listening to the sommelier describe a dessert wine, his expression impassive. Queen Serafina was smiling at him, her hand now resting on his arm. It was the most monstrous thing Anna had ever seen. A performance of love and loyalty, masking a plot of cold-blooded murder. Panic seized her, a physical force that threatened to buckle her knees. What could she do? Scream? Cause a scene? They would dismiss her as a hysterical waitress. They would silence her before the first word had fully left her mouth. Vorlag and his men would kill her without a second thought, and the Queen would watch them do it with that same empty smile. She had to warn him, but how? She couldn't speak to him directly. His guards, the very men the Queen had compromised, stood like sentinels around the table. Approaching the king unbidden was a death sentence. Her mind raced, sifting through 1,000 impossible options. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a solution, a weapon, anything. They landed on the king's table setting. The heavy linen napkin, folded into an elaborate swan, sat beside his plate. An idea, desperate and terrifying, began to form. It was insane. It was suicidal. But it was the only chance he had. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and adrenaline. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The treaty signing was scheduled for the end of the meal. She had minutes at most. The decision solidified in her mind, not as a choice, but as a command from some deeper part of herself that refused to be a bystander to murder. The fear was still there, a cold serpent coiling in her gut, but it was now overlaid with a sheet of ice-cold resolve. Her movements became deliberate, each one a calculated risk. She walked back to her station near the kitchen, her steps even, her posture unchanged. No one could know. No one could see the storm raging inside her. Her hands, however, were not so easily controlled. They shook as she pulled a small notepad and a pen from her apron pocket. The paper was cheap, flimsy, the kind used for scribbling down orders for coffee and dessert. On this fragile medium, she would write a king's death warrant or his salvation. Her mind raced to find the right words. Too much information, and he would dismiss it as a prank. Too little, and he wouldn't understand the urgency. It had to be concise, powerful, and above all, believable. She thought of the Queen's chillingly serene smile. The betrayal was the key. That was the detail that would cut through his disbelief. She scribbled quickly, her handwriting jagged with adrenaline. 6 words. "Your queen sold you out. Go now." It was stark, brutal. It left no room for doubt. She tore the small square of paper from the pad and folded it into a tiny, tight rectangle, no bigger than her thumbnail. It felt impossibly small to hold such a monstrous secret. Now came the most dangerous part, the delivery. She needed a reason to approach the table again, a reason to touch his napkin. She scanned the dining room, her brain working faster than it ever had. An opportunity presented itself. A busboy, clumsy and new, jostled a nearby table, sending a splash of red wine onto the floor near the king's chair. It was perfect. A flaw in the perfect service, an excuse she could use. Before her manager could dispatch someone else, Anna was already moving. She grabbed a fresh linen napkin from a service drawer, her hands now miraculously steady. The folded note was concealed in her palm, pressed against her skin. She approached the royal table, her eyes fixed on the floor near the king's feet. "My apologies, Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice a low, respectful hum. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She was afraid her eyes would betray the terror and urgency she felt. "A small spill. Allow me to refresh your napkin." She knelt, ostensibly to check the floor, but it was a feint. Her real target was the table setting. With one swift, practiced motion, she picked up the folded swan napkin from the table. As she did, her other hand, the one holding the note, moved with it. In the space of a heartbeat, a move too fast for the eye to track, she slipped the tiny, folded paper into the deepest crease of the linen. Then she stood, placing the soiled napkin on her tray and unfolding the fresh one with a crisp snap. She laid it down where the other had been, the secret now hidden in plain sight. Her part was done. She had passed the message. The rest was up to him. She bowed her head slightly. "Enjoy your evening," she said, her voice betraying none of the chaos inside her. She turned and walked away, each step an exercise in control. She did not look back. She could feel his eyes on her, the weight of his royal gaze. Had he noticed? Did he see the sleight of hand? Or did he just see another faceless servant performing a menial task? The walk back to her station felt like a mile. The air seemed to thicken, the sounds of the restaurant fading into a dull roar in her ears. She reached the relative safety of the service corridor and leaned against the cool wall, her legs suddenly weak. She had done it. She had interfered in the affairs of wolves, and now she could only pray they wouldn't devour her for it. She risked a glance back into the dining room. From her vantage point, she could see the king. He had picked up the napkin. Her heart stopped. He was unfolding it, preparing to place it on his lap. Time seemed to slow down. She watched as his large hands worked the linen as the fabric fell open. The tiny note would be there, sitting innocently in the center of the pristine white square. She saw his hands pause. A stillness came over him, a sudden, absolute rigidity that was terrifying to behold. His gaze dropped to his lap. He didn't react, not in any way a normal person would. There was no gasp, no sudden movement, but Anna, the observer, saw the change. The shift was seismic. The air around his table grew cold, heavy. The predator, who had been resting, was now awake. And he was furious. He had read it. He knew. Now the question was, what would he do? And what would happen to the ghost who had warned him? King Lycan felt the foreign object in his napkin the instant his fingers brushed against it. It was a small, hard-edged anomaly in the soft, yielding linen. His first thought was that it was a flaw in the fabric, an imperfection. But as his fingers closed around it, he knew it was something more. It was deliberate. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of regal indifference he had perfected over a century of rule. Outwardly, he was listening to Seraphina recount a tedious story about a courtier's latest scandal, but his entire being was focused on the small object in his hand. He unfolded the napkin in his lap, below the line of sight of the table. There it was, a tiny folded piece of cheap paper. It was not the perfumed, high-quality stationery of an aristocrat or the official parchment of a court summons. It was common, disposable. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and hurried. 6 words that felt like a punch to the gut. Your queen sold you out. Go now. His mind, a formidable weapon honed by decades of political intrigue and warfare, processed the information with brutal efficiency. His first instinct was to dismiss it, a prank, an insult from a rival, trying to sow discord, a madman's raving. But something held him back, the sheer audacity of it. The delivery method was ingenious in its simplicity, untraceable and silent. Who would risk instant death to pass him such a message? And why? He let his eyes drift to his queen, Seraphina, his mate, the woman who had stood by his side for 20 years. She was laughing now, a light, musical sound that had once captivated him. Tonight it sounded brittle, hollow. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in a long time. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible tension around her eyes. He saw the way her fingers, adorned with the royal signet rings he had given her, were clenched just a little too tightly around the stem of her wine-glass. He saw the fleeting glance she shot towards Lord Vorlag's table, a look he had previously dismissed as idle curiosity, now filtered through the lens of those 6 terrifying words. It looked like conspiracy. The note did not create the suspicion. It merely gave a name to a vague unease that had been growing in him for months. Seraphina's increasing secrecy. Her closed-door meetings with council members who opposed his policies. Her sudden, passionate advocacy for this treaty with Vorlag, a man he had always known to be a treacherous snake. He had attributed it to her growing political ambition, a desire to be more than just a decorative queen. He had even been proud of her. What a fool he had been. He felt a cold, hard knot of fury form in his chest. It was a rage so pure and so absolute that it threatened to overwhelm him, to make him leap across the table and tear the truth from her throat. But he was a king, and a king did not act on raw emotion. He acted with strategy and lethal precision. He had to leave, now. The note commanded it. His own instincts screamed it. But he could not just stand up and run. That would be an admission of weakness, an invitation for his enemies to strike. He needed a pretext, a plausible reason for such an abrupt departure from a state dinner. He subtly scanned the room, his golden eyes missing nothing. He saw the waitress who had replaced his napkin. She was standing near a service station, her back to him, pretending to be busy. He committed her to memory. Her height, the way she stood, the dark curls tied tightly at the nape of her neck. She was a key. Either she was the source of this treachery or the source of his salvation. In either case, he would find her. He turned back to Seraphina, forcing a relaxed smile onto his face. "My dear," he said, his voice smooth as silk, betraying none of the violent storm within him. "I just received a priority message on my private line." He tapped his ear where a state-of-the-art, nearly invisible communication device was nestled. It was a lie. The device was silent. "An urgent matter at the Northern Citadel. It requires my immediate attention." Seraphina's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of panic, of confusion, crossed her face before it was replaced by a mask of wifely concern. "Lycan, is everything all right? Can it not wait until after the treaty signing?" Her insistence was the final piece of confirmation he needed. She wanted him here. She needed him here, at this table, for their plan to work. "I'm afraid not," he said, his voice hardening with an edge of command she could not mistake. He pushed his chair back, the sound of it scraping against the marble floor, unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "Duty calls." He stood to his full, imposing height, casting a long shadow over the table. He looked down at her, his gaze intense, searching. "You will make my apologies to Lord Vorlag. We will reschedule the signing." He did not wait for a reply. He turned and strode from the dining room, his personal guards, the men she had supposedly compromised, scrambling to fall into formation around him. He felt their proximity not as a comfort, but as a potential threat. Every one of them was now a suspect. As he walked, he crumbled the small note in his fist, the cheap paper a brand against his skin. He had the warning. Now came the war. He didn't know who to trust, who to believe. All he knew was that he was a king walking out of his own castle, surrounded by enemies, with his life hanging on the courage of a nameless waitress. The world had shifted beneath his feet, and the only solid ground he had was a 6-word message written on a scrap of paper. He was the Alpha King, and he was being hunted. The game had just begun. The moment King Lycan swept out of the room, a wave of confusion rippled through the Ethelgard dining hall. His departure was so abrupt, so contrary to royal protocol, that it left a vacuum in his wake. Conversations faltered. Diners exchanged puzzled glances. The carefully constructed atmosphere of opulent calm was shattered. Anna felt the shift from the relative safety of the service corridor. It was like a change in air pressure, a sudden drop that signaled an approaching storm. She watched as Queen Seraphina, for a moment, lost her composure. Her face, usually a mask of serene control, was a canvas of disbelief and barely suppressed fury. She exchanged a look with Lord Vorlag across the room, a frantic, panicked communication that was as loud as a scream. Vorlag's face was a thundercloud. He slammed his fist on his table, a muffled thud that caused his wineglasses to jump. The treaty, the poison, the entire elaborate coup had just been derailed. And no one knew why. Anna's heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. He had listened. He had believed her. He was safe for now. But what about her? She was the loose end, the anonymous source, She had to disappear. She turned and fled into the cacophony of the kitchen. The chefs and line cooks were shouting orders, pans were clattering, flames were leaping from grills. It was a world of controlled chaos, a perfect place to become invisible again. She ripped off her apron and threw it into a laundry bin, her movements jerky and panicked. "I'm sick," she muttered to a passing dishwasher who barely glanced at her. "I have to go." She didn't wait for permission. She pushed through the swinging doors that led to the back alley, gulping in the cold night air. The alley was damp and smelled of grease and garbage, a stark contrast to the perfumed world she had just left. It felt real. It felt safe. She leaned against the rough brick wall, trying to calm the frantic shaking of her hands. She had just committed treason or saved a life, maybe both. She had no idea what the consequences would be, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could never go back to Ethelgard's. Her life as a waitress, the quiet, observant ghost, was over. She had touched the world of monsters, and it had marked her. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself and began to walk, melting into the shadows of the city. She had no destination, no plan. She was just running. Back in the restaurant, the royal party was imploding. Queen Seraphina had regained her composure, her face once again a beautiful, cold mask. She rose from her seat with regal grace. "The king has been called away on an urgent matter of state," she announced to the room, her voice carrying a clear, commanding tone. "Please continue your meals. The crown apologizes for the interruption." It was a masterful performance. She was reclaiming control of the narrative, smoothing over the rupture in protocol. But those who were watching closely, like Vorlog, saw the lie. They saw the fury simmering just beneath the surface. Seraphina and her entourage swept out of the restaurant, leaving a trail of unease behind them. Lord Vorlog and his men followed moments later, their faces grim. The prey had escaped the trap. The night's work was a failure. The restaurant manager, a man named Julian, whose entire life revolved around maintaining the illusion of perfection, was in a state of near apoplexy. The king had left without finishing his meal. A treaty signing had been aborted. It was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. He began barking at the staff, his voice high and tight with panic. "Clear the table. Someone find out what happened. Where is Anna?" The name hung in the air. Anna, the waitress assigned to the royal table. The one who had knelt to clean a spill moments before the king's departure. Julian's eyes narrowed. It was too much of a coincidence. He scanned the floor, his gaze falling upon the service station where Anna had been standing. He marched over, his mind racing. He found her discarded apron in the kitchen laundry. She was gone. She had clocked out without telling anyone, a severe breach of protocol. A seed of suspicion took root in his mind. The waitress was involved. He didn't know how, but he knew it. He had to protect his restaurant, his reputation. He made a decision. He would report her disappearance to the Queen's staff. It was the proper thing to do. He would tell them a waitress had behaved erratically and then vanished on the night of the king's visit. Let them handle it. It was the safest course of action for him, a way to absolve himself of any responsibility. It was also, though he did not know it, a death sentence for Anna. He was pointing the wolves directly to her door, giving them the name of the one person who could expose their entire conspiracy. Anna, meanwhile, was miles away, riding a late-night bus across the city. her face pressed against the cool glass. Every passing headlight felt like a searchlight. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She had no idea that her name was already being whispered in the halls of power, a name attached to a crime she could never have imagined. She had tried to be a ghost, but in her one desperate act of humanity, she had become the most hunted woman in the kingdom. The game of wolves had found its first pawn, and she was it. The armored vehicle sliced through the city streets with silent electric efficiency. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. King Lycan sat alone in the spacious rear cabin, the fury in his chest having cooled into something far more dangerous. A diamond-hard certainty. The betrayal was no longer a shocking possibility. It was a fact, a new and terrible cornerstone of his reality. He stared out at the blurred city lights, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing Serafina's face, replaying 2 decades of their life together in his mind. He saw her at their mating ceremony, her eyes bright with what he had believed was love. He saw her advising him in the war council, her intellect sharp, and her counsel, he now realized, subtly self-serving. He saw her comforting him after his father's death, her arms around him, a viper embracing the man she would one day plot to kill. How much of it had been a lie? All of it? Was their entire relationship the foundation of his personal life and a cornerstone of his reign, just a long, elaborate deception? The thought was a poison of its own, seeping into every memory, tainting every shared moment. The emotional wound was deep, a gaping chasm of grief and rage, but he could not afford to indulge it. Emotion was a luxury a king at war could not afford. He had to be cold, calculating, he had to survive. He pressed a button on the console beside him. "Marcus," he said, his voice low and steady, "meet me at the Citadel, full security protocol. No one in or out without my direct authorization. Trust no one, especially not the Queen's guard." "Understood, my king," a voice crackled back, calm and unwavering. Marcus Thorne, his beta, his second in command, and the only soul in the world Lycan knew, with absolute certainty he could trust. They had been blooded together as pups, had fought back to back in a dozen border skirmishes. Marcus's loyalty was not to the crown or the throne, it was to Lycan himself. When he arrived at the Citadel, a brutalist fortress of black stone and reinforced steel hidden in the city's industrial heart, Marcus was waiting for him. Marcus was a stark contrast to Lycan's overt power. He was leaner, quieter, his presence less a roar and more a blade in the shadows. His eyes, a pale, intelligent gray, saw everything. "The Citadel is on lockdown," Marcus reported, falling into step beside his king as they strode through the stark, echoing corridors. "What happened at the dinner?" Lycan waited until they were in his private command center, a room shielded from all forms of electronic and magical surveillance. The heavy vault door sealed behind them with a heavy thud. Only then did he speak. He unfurled his clenched fist and placed the crumpled piece of paper on the large tactical table in the center of the room. Marcus picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read the 6 words, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief and then to cold fury. "Serafina," he whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's impossible." "Is it?" Lycan countered, his voice flat. "Think, Marcus, her sudden alliance with the Silver Moon Coven, her insistence on this ridiculous treaty with a dog like Vorlog, her arguments in the council to reduce funding for our intelligence network. The signs were there. We were just too blind to see them." Marcus stared at the note, then back at his king. He saw the pain behind the rage in Lycan's eyes. "Who gave you this?" Lycan described the waitress, the quiet efficiency, the way she moved, the sleight of hand he had barely registered at the time. "She was a ghost, no name, no face I can clearly recall. But she saved my life tonight. And in doing so, she likely signed her own death warrant. Serafina and Vorlag will not allow such a witness to live." "We need to find her," Marcus stated, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. "Before they do." "I agree," Lycan said. "But we have a more immediate problem. The guards. The note said she compromised my personal guard." A chilling thought passed between the two men. The guards who had escorted him from the restaurant, who were at that very moment standing outside the command center door, could be assassins waiting for their moment. "Seal this room," Lycan commanded, "and run a full diagnostic on every member of my detail. Financial records, communications, known associates. Cross-reference everything with Serafina's and Vorlag's networks. I want to know who they've spoken to, who they've met with, who has paid them." Marcus moved to a terminal, his fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. "It's already underway," he said. "The moment you issued the lockdown order, our internal AI began the sweep. We'll have preliminary results within the hour." Lycan paced the room like a caged lion. He was trapped in his own fortress, surrounded by potential traitors. His kingdom, which had seemed so secure an hour ago, was now a house of cards. His wife, his queen, had betrayed him. His enemies were circling. And his only ally was a nameless woman who had vanished into the night. He felt a surge of respect, of gratitude for this unknown waitress. In a world of powerful, posturing wolves, a human woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose had shown more courage and loyalty than his own mate. "Find her, Marcus," Lycan commanded, his voice a low growl. "Use every resource we have. Find the ghost who saved the king. Protect her at all costs. She is the key to all of this." He knew with a chilling certainty that it was a race between his own formidable resources and the ruthless efficiency of a queen who would stop at nothing to cover her tracks. It was a race for Anna's life. Anna spent the first 24 hours in a state of heightened, terrified awareness. Every siren was for her. Every stranger's glance was a threat. She found a cheap, no-questions-asked motel on the city's grimy periphery, paying in cash and using a fake name she invented on the spot. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarettes and despair, but the lock on the door felt like the strongest fortress wall in the world. She sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, watching the local news on the small, flickering television. Waiting for her face to appear, she expected to see a breaking news report. Waitress wanted for questioning in connection with royal incident. But there was nothing. The news cycle was dominated by a carefully worded press release from the palace. King Lycan had been taken ill with a sudden but minor ailment, forcing the postponement of the treaty signing with the Northern Ridge Pack. Queen Serafina was by his side. It was a lie, a smooth, plausible fabrication designed to quell public concern and hide the rot within the monarchy. The lack of news was both a relief and a source of profound terror. It meant they weren't using the official channels. They were hunting for her in the shadows. This wasn't a police matter, it was an execution order. She replayed the events in the restaurant over and over in her mind, dissecting every moment. Had anyone seen her write the note? Had the busboy noticed her strange behavior? Did the manager, Julian, suspect anything? The fear of the unknown was a physical ache, a constant pressure behind her eyes. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old motel, every footstep in the corridor outside her door, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. She was living on her nerves, a hunted animal who didn't even know what the hunter looked like. On the second day, she knew she couldn't stay there. The motel was a temporary refuge at best. She needed to get further away, to change her appearance, to erase Anna from existence. She ventured out, her head down, a cheap baseball cap pulled low over her face. She went to a pharmacy and bought a box of cheap black hair dye, scissors, and a pair of non-prescription glasses with thick frames. Back in the grimy motel bathroom, she stared at her reflection. It was the face of a stranger, pale with fear, eyes wide and haunted. She took the scissors and hacked at her long dark curls, the hair she had spent years growing. Shorn locks fell into the sink, a painful sacrifice to anonymity. The clumsy, uneven haircut was jarring. Then came the dye, a harsh chemical smell filling the small room. When she was done, she looked again. The woman staring back at her was different, harder. The severe, short black hair and the heavy glasses changed the shape of her face, hiding the quiet observer and replacing her with someone more severe, more forgettable. It was a flimsy disguise, but it was all she had. She packed her few belongings into a small backpack, left the motel key on the counter, and slipped out the back door. She took a series of buses heading south, with no destination in mind other than away. She was burning through the cash she had, the entirety of her savings. Every dollar spent was another step away from her old life, and one step closer to an uncertain, terrifying future. She didn't know that at the same time, two very different hunts were closing in on her. The first was clumsy but brutal. Queen Seraphina, furious and desperate, had outsourced the task to Lord Vorlag. Vorlag's men were thugs, not spies. They started at Ethelgard's. They persuaded the terrified manager, Julian, to give them Anna's employee file, her address, her next of kin, a grainy photocopy of her ID. They were a sledgehammer trying to perform surgery. They kicked in the door of her small apartment, tearing the place apart, terrifying her neighbors. They visited her estranged mother, scaring the poor woman half to death. They were leaving a trail of chaos and fear, a trail that was easy for a more sophisticated hunter to follow. The second hunt was silent, precise, and lethally efficient. Marcus Thorne did not use thugs, he used data. From the Citadel's command center, he deployed the full, terrifying power of the kingdom's surveillance state. He had a name, Anna, and a place of employment. Within minutes, he had the same employee file Vorlag's men had beaten out of the manager. But he also had more. He had her digital footprint, her social media profiles, which she rarely used, her credit card transactions, her cell phone records. He saw the last charge on her card, the motel on the edge of the city. He saw her phone go dark shortly after. He knew she was running. He deployed a team of elite trackers, werewolves whose senses could pick up a scent, on a cold trail days later. They were not to engage. They were to locate, observe, and protect. They followed the trail of Vorlag's thugs, using their chaotic search as a map pointing them in the right direction. Marcus could see both hunts converging on his screen. two predator groups closing in on a single, unaware target. And Vorlag's men were closer. "They're going to get to her first," Marcus said, his voice tight, speaking to Lycan, who stood watching over his shoulder. "They'll kill her and disappear." "No, they won't," Lycan growled, his golden eyes fixed on the screen. "Redirect the city's traffic control. Cause a multi-car pileup on the interstate heading south. Block their path. Buy our team some time." Marcus's fingers flew across the console. Miles away, a series of traffic lights turned green out of sequence. A semi-truck swerved to avoid a car running a red light, and suddenly a major highway was a parking lot of twisted metal and blaring horns. It was a godlike display of power, the subtle manipulation of an entire city's infrastructure to protect one woman. On a bus stuck in that very traffic jam, Anna stared out the window, completely unaware that the chaos outside was a shield, a barrier being erected around her by a king she had never formally met. She just felt a growing sense of dread, the feeling of a net tightening, a trap being sprung. The hunt was reaching its endgame. The confrontation came at a desolate bus station in a forgotten town, 100 miles south of the city. The place smelled of diesel fumes and desperation. Anna had been waiting for a connecting bus, huddled on a cold plastic bench, trying to make herself as small as possible. The traffic jam had delayed her for hours, fraying her already shattered nerves. She saw them first. Two large, brutish men got out of a black sedan in the parking lot. They didn't look like they belonged here. They wore expensive leather jackets and had the easy, arrogant menace of men who were used to taking what they wanted. They weren't trying to be subtle. They scanned the small crowd at the bus station, their eyes like chips of ice. Anna knew with a certainty that froze the blood in her veins that they were looking for her. Her disguise, which had felt so clever in the motel bathroom, now seemed like a child's costume. She pulled the baseball cap lower and sank deeper into her jacket, praying they would overlook her. But their eyes swept over her, paused, and then locked on. One of them smirked and nudged his partner, pointing his chin in her direction. They had found her. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. There was nowhere to run. The station was a small, brightly lit box surrounded by a vast, dark parking lot. She was trapped. They started walking towards her, their steps unhurried, confident. They were predators who knew their prey was cornered. Anna's mind raced. Fight? Scream? She was no match for them. They would overpower her in seconds. Just as the first man reached her, his hand reaching out to grab her arm, a second car, a sleek, unassuming gray sedan, pulled up to the curb with a faint squeal of tires. The doors opened and two figures emerged. They were nothing like the thugs. They moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. One was a tall man with pale gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The other was a woman with sharp features and a coiled, watchful intensity. Marcus Thorne and one of his elite trackers. "That's far enough," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Vorlag's men stopped, startled by the sudden intervention. They looked from Marcus to Anna and back again. "This is private business," the first thug growled, trying to regain his footing. "Step aside." "I don't think so," Marcus replied, a faint, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "You see, the lady is with us." The air crackled with tension. A silent standoff in a forgotten bus station. Anna was caught between two sets of monsters, unsure of which was more dangerous. The two thugs exchanged a look. They were bigger, more muscular. They decided to press their advantage. The first one lunged, not at Marcus, but at Anna, trying to grab her and use her as a shield. He never made it. Marcus moved with a speed that defied belief. One moment he was standing by the car, the next he was in front of Anna, his hand clamped around the thug's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. The thug screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and crumpled to the ground, cradling his shattered arm. The second thug, seeing his partner so easily dispatched, hesitated for a fatal second. The female tracker moved in, a blur of motion. She struck him twice, sharp, precise blows to his throat and knee. He went down, gasping for air, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. It was over in less than 5 seconds. A display of brutal, terrifying efficiency. Marcus stood over the groaning men, his expression unreadable. He looked at Anna, who was pressed back against the bench, her eyes wide with terror. "Anna," he said, his voice softening slightly. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am Beta to King Lycan. We are not here to harm you. We are here to protect you." Anna stared at him, her mind unable to process the whirlwind of events. Protect her? These people, who had just broken bones with casual ease, were her saviors. "The king sent us," Marcus continued, seeing the disbelief on her face. "He knows what you did. He is grateful, but you are in grave danger. The men who sent these two will not stop looking for you. You must come with us." He extended a hand to her. It was a gesture of peace, an invitation. But Anna couldn't stop shaking. She had run from one world only to be dragged deeper into it. She looked at the men writhing on the ground, then back at Marcus's outstretched hand. She had no choice. Staying here meant death. Going with them meant stepping into the heart of the very danger she had been fleeing. She took a deep breath, the cold night air doing little to calm her racing heart. Slowly, hesitantly, she took his hand. His grip was firm, steady. It was the first moment of security she had felt in days, and it was terrifying. They led her to the car, leaving the two thugs incapacitated on the pavement. As she got in, she knew her life had irrevocably changed. There was no going back to her small apartment, to her invisible life as a waitress. She was now under the protection of a king, a player in a deadly game of power and betrayal. The gray sedan pulled away from the bus station, disappearing into the night. It moved with the same silent efficiency as its occupants, a ghost car carrying a ghost of a woman to an unknown fate. Her journey into the heart of the wolf's den had begun. The destination was the Citadel and a meeting with the king she had saved. The Citadel was not a palace, it was a weapon. From the outside, it was an imposing, windowless monolith of black granite. Inside, it was a labyrinth of stark corridors, advanced technology, and hushed, watchful guards. It was the military and intelligence heart of Lycan's kingdom, a place where wars were planned and secrets were kept. Anna felt impossibly small and out of place as Marcus led her through its silent halls. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and steel. Everyone they passed, from guards in tactical gear to analysts in lab coats, moved with a sense of purpose and deferred to Marcus with a quiet nod. They looked at Anna with undisguised curiosity, a human, a civilian in the heart of their sanctuary. It was unheard of. Marcus brought her to a suite of rooms that were more luxurious than her old apartment, but felt like a gilded cage. They were comfortable, with a soft bed, a private bathroom, and a small sitting area. but the windows were made of reinforced plexiglass, and there was no handle on the inside of the door. "You will be safe here," Marcus told her, his tone professional but not unkind. "No one can get to you. Rest. We will bring you food." He left, the door sealing with a soft hiss and a heavy clank of a magnetic lock. Anna was alone, but she felt more watched than ever. She sank onto the bed, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She had been running for days, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Now, in this strange, sterile safety, the exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She slept, a deep, dreamless sleep that was a mercy. When she woke hours later, there was a tray of food on a small table. It was simple but delicious, a warm stew and fresh bread. She ate, her hunger a surprise to her. As she finished, the door hissed open again. This time it was not Marcus, it was him. King Lycan entered the room, and her breath caught in her throat. If he had been imposing in the restaurant, here in his own domain, he was a force of nature. He had shed the civilized trapping of the bespoke suit, and now wore simple black trousers and a dark gray Henley shirt that did nothing to hide the sheer power of his physique. His molten gold eyes were fixed on her, and she felt pinned by his gaze, analyzed and assessed down to her very soul. He moved with a predator's grace, closing the door behind him. The room, which had seemed spacious moments before, suddenly felt small, charged with his presence. He did not speak immediately. He just watched her, his expression a complex mixture of curiosity, gratitude, and something else, something deeper she couldn't name. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs. She was alone with the Alpha King, the most powerful being she had ever encountered. She felt an instinctual urge to lower her eyes, to make herself small, the ingrained deference of a human in the presence of a superior predator. But she fought it. She had not risked her life to cower now. She met his gaze, her own dark eyes steady, though it took every ounce of her willpower. Finally he spoke, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. "You are the waitress," he said. It was not a question. "My name is Anna," she replied, her voice quieter than she would have liked, but it didn't tremble. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Anna," he repeated, tasting the name. "I do not know what I expected, but it was not you." He took a step closer. "You are human. You have no stake in our politics. You owe me no loyalty. So I must ask you, Anna, why? Why did you risk your life to warn a stranger?" It was the question she had been asking herself. Why had she done it? It wasn't for a reward or for glory. It was simpler than that. "It was wrong," she said, her voice gaining strength. "What they were planning. To murder someone in cold blood, your own wife betraying you. It was a monstrous thing. I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. I couldn't live with the silence." Her answer seemed to surprise him. He had expected a plea for her life, a request for payment, a story of old loyalties. He had not expected such a simple, profound declaration of morality. It was a human sentiment, one that was often lost in the brutal calculus of werewolf politics. A slow smile touched his lips, a genuine expression that transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. "A conscience," he said, almost to himself. "How rare." He looked at her, and for the first time she did not feel like a subject being scrutinized by a king. She felt like a person being seen by a man. "You saved my life, Anna," he said, his voice losing its regal tone and becoming something more personal. I am in your debt, a debt I fully intend to repay. Your old life is gone. Those who tried to kill me will not rest until they find you. But I give you my word, as long as you are with me, you will be protected. They will have to go through me to get to you. It was a vow, an oath sworn by a king. It should have made her feel safe. But looking into his intense golden eyes, Anna realized she had not escaped danger. She had just exchanged one kind for another. The danger of assassins in the shadows was replaced by the overwhelming, consuming danger of the man standing right in front of her. The wolf she had saved was now her protector, and she was trapped in his den. The next few days passed in a strange, surreal routine. Anna remained in her protected suite, a gilded cage within the heart of the citadel. She was treated not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. She was given new clothes, books, access to entertainment systems, anything she asked for. Marcus was her primary point of contact, a calm, professional presence who answered her questions patiently and ensured she was comfortable. But it was the king's visits that marked her days. Lycan came to see her every evening. Their conversations started as interrogations. He needed every detail of the conversation she had overheard at the restaurant. He made her repeat it again and again, dissecting every word, every nuance. He wanted to know about Lord Vorlag, about his men, about the Queen's expression. Anna, with her keen observer's memory, gave him everything. She described the subtle tells, the micro-expressions, the undercurrent of conspiracy she had sensed even before she heard the words. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his mind clearly working, fitting the pieces of the puzzle together. Slowly, however, the nature of their conversations began to change. He started asking about her life before all this, her family, her dreams. He seemed fascinated by her quiet, ordinary existence, so different from his own life of constant conflict and political maneuvering. In turn, she began to see the man behind the crown. She saw the deep weariness in his eyes, the immense burden of leadership he carried. She saw the raw pain of Seraphina's betrayal, a wound that was still fresh and bleeding. He never spoke of it directly, but she could see it in the way he would fall silent, his gaze distant, his jaw tight with suppressed rage and sorrow. In this strange, isolated environment, an unlikely bond began to form between them. It was built on a foundation of shared crisis and mutual respect. He respected her courage and her integrity. She respected his strength and the surprising vulnerability he showed only to her. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to the low rumble of his voice and the intensity of his presence. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met. And yet, in a world that wanted her dead, he was the only source of safety. One evening he arrived looking more troubled than usual. He paced her small sitting room, the caged lion energy back in full force. "The council is demanding a public address," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "They want to see their king. They want to see their queen. The official story of my illness is wearing thin. Seraphina is using my absence to her advantage, spreading rumors that I am weak, that my mind is failing. She is consolidating her power, gathering allies." "So what are you going to do?" Anna asked, her voice quiet. He stopped pacing and looked at her. "I'm going to give them what they want," he said, a dangerous glint in his golden eyes. "I will hold a grand council. I will summon the alphas of all 7 packs, including Vorlog. I will stand before them with my queen by my side. We will project an image of unity and strength. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. You're walking back into the trap. No, he corrected her. This time I'm the one setting the trap. Serafina and Vorlog believe their secret is safe. They believe the only witness is a nameless dead waitress. They will be confident, arrogant, and in their arrogance they will expose themselves. He moved closer to her, his gaze locking with hers. But I need your help, Anna. My word against the queens is not enough. I need a witness. I need you to tell them what you heard. The blood drained from her face. He wanted her to stand up in front of a council of werewolves, the most powerful and ruthless beings in the land, and accuse their queen of treason. It was a death sentence. They'll tear me apart, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. They will not touch you, Lycan vowed, his voice a low, fierce growl. You will be under my personal protection. I swear on my life, no harm will come to you. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and firm, sending a jolt of electricity through her. I know I am asking the impossible. You have already risked everything for me once. I have no right to ask you to do so again. But you are the only one who can expose the truth. You are the only one who can save my kingdom from a traitor. He was asking her to be more than a witness. He was asking her to be a warrior, to fight in his war. He was asking her to have faith in him, to trust that he could protect her from the wrath of the very people she was about to condemn. She looked into his eyes, into the eyes of the king who had shown her a sliver of the man beneath. She saw the desperation there, the plea for help. She had started this avalanche with a single, handwritten note. She couldn't walk away from it now. I'll do it, she said, her voice shaking, but firm. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was startling. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. Thank you, Anna, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The trap was set. The stage was being prepared for a grand public confrontation. And Anna, the waitress who was supposed to be a ghost, was about to become the star witness in the trial of a queen. The fate of the kingdom now rested on her shoulders. The day of the Grand Council arrived with a palpable sense of dread and anticipation. The citadel was buzzing with activity. Alphas from the 7 packs, along with their entourages, had arrived, turning the stark military fortress into a hotbed of political tension. The air was thick with the conflicting sense of power, ambition, and suspicion. Anna was moved from her quiet suite to a small shielded chamber directly behind the main council hall. From a one-way screen, she could see the hall filling up. It was a vast circular chamber, stark and imposing, with 7 obsidian thrones for the visiting alphas and 1 larger, elevated throne of iron and weirwood at its head. It was a place built for judgment. Lycan had briefed her on the plan meticulously. He would open the council with standard proceedings. He would allow Serafina to play her part as the loyal queen. Then, at the opportune moment, he would reveal his hand. Anna's part was to wait, to watch, and to be ready. A skilled stylist had been sent to her room. She was dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue, a color that spoke of loyalty and truth. Her hair was styled to look professional and severe. The goal was not to make her beautiful, but to make her credible. To erase the last vestiges of the harried, frightened waitress and replace her with a woman of substance and conviction. Despite the calm facade she was trying to project, her insides were churning with fear. Through the screen, she watched them all take their places. She saw Lord Vorlag, his face a mask of smug arrogance, taking his seat. And then she saw the Queen. Seraphina was breathtaking. She wore a gown of shimmering silver, the color of her pack, and a crown of diamonds glittered in her hair. She walked with an air of absolute confidence, smiling and greeting the other alphas. She took her place on a slightly smaller throne next to Lycan's, the perfect image of a regal, supportive mate. Looking at her, so poised and beloved, Anna felt a surge of doubt. Who would believe her, a human commoner, over this magnificent queen? Lycan entered last. The hall fell silent. He walked to his throne with a heavy, deliberate tread, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He looked every inch the king, powerful and absolute. He sat, and the council began. He spoke of pack business, of trade routes and border disputes. It was mundane, procedural, and utterly nerve-wracking for Anna. She watched Seraphina, who looked relaxed, even bored. She was playing her part perfectly. Vorlag, too, seemed at ease. They believed they were safe. They believed their plan was still in motion, merely delayed. Then Lycan changed the subject. "And now," he said, his voice suddenly dropping, taking on a harder edge that cut through the room's complacency, "we must address the issue of the recent attempt on my life." A collective gasp went through the hall. Whispers erupted. Seraphina's head whipped around to look at him, her eyes well with feigned shock. "My love," she said, her voice filled with concern. "An attempt on your life? Why was I not told?" "Because, my dear," Lycan replied, his voice dripping with ice, "the conspirators were closer than you can possibly imagine." He stood up, his towering presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. "On the night of the treaty dinner, I received a warning that my life was in danger, that my own queen had sold me out to my enemies." The accusation hung in the air, stunning the council into absolute silence. Seraphina leaped to her feet, her face a mask of outrage. "Lycan, how dare you? This is madness. You are unwell. Someone has poisoned your mind against me," she cried, her voice ringing with betrayal. It was a brilliant performance. She was turning his accusation back on him, painting him as a paranoid or delusional king. Several of the alphas murmured in agreement, looking at Lycan with concern. Lord Vorlag stood as well. "Your Majesty, this is a grave and baseless accusation against your fated mate, our queen. You must have proof for such a treasonous claim." "Proof?" Lycan said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Oh, I have proof." He gestured to the large doors at the side of the hall. "Bring in the witness." The doors swung open. Marcus entered, and by his side was Anna. Every eye in the hall turned to her. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical force that threatened to crush her. The room was filled with werewolves, predators of immense power, and she was a lone human walking into their midst. Her heart pounded in her ears, but she kept walking, her eyes fixed on Lycan. He was her anchor in this sea of hostile faces. She reached the center of the hall and stood before the thrones, a small, solitary figure in a vast arena. "Who is this commoner?" Seraphina sneered, her voice filled with contempt. "What is the meaning of this farce?" "This," Lycan announced, his voice booming through the hall, "is Anna, a waitress from the Ethelgard restaurant. The woman who overheard your treason, the woman who saved my life. Anna took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. She looked directly at Queen Seraphina, her gaze unwavering. It was time to speak. The ghost was about to find her voice. The silence in the council hall was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every alpha, every retainer, every guard was staring at Anna, this impossible variable in their world of predictable power. Seraphina was the first to break the silence, a laugh bubbling from her throat. It was a beautiful sound and utterly contemptuous. "A waitress?" she scoffed, turning to the other alphas as if sharing a private joke. "My king, my love, you have been deceived. This is absurd. Lord Vorlag and I were discussing a treaty to bring peace to our borders, and you bring forth a servant with a wild tale to accuse me of treason. She is clearly a pawn, paid by our enemies to sow discord. Look at her. She is probably a spy from the Eastern Pax." Her words were clever, twisting the situation, planting seeds of doubt. She was dismissing Anna, rendering her irrelevant by virtue of her station. It was a classic tactic of the powerful: discredit the messenger when you cannot dispute the message. But Lycan was prepared for it. He did not look at Seraphina, he looked at Anna. "Tell them," he commanded, his voice calm and steady, a rock for her to anchor herself to. "Tell them what you heard." Anna's throat was dry. Her pulse was a frantic drum against her skin. But she met Seraphina's cold, hateful glare and began to speak. Her voice, though not loud, was clear and carried through the acoustically perfect chamber. "I was working at Ethelgard's on the night of the treaty dinner," she began, her words measured and precise. "I was standing near the pillar by table 7. Lord Vorlag was at that table." She pointed a steady finger at the Northern Ridge Alpha, who flinched as if struck. He was speaking to one of his men. He thought no one could hear him. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. He said, "The moment the treaty is signed, the poison in the ceremonial pen will be instantaneous." He said, "Seraphina has ensured his personal guard is compromised. They will not intervene." He said, "By the time he hits the floor, the crown is ours." Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the queen's composure. The color drained from Seraphina's face. The feigned outrage was replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice losing its regal control and becoming shrill. "She is lying. How could a human even understand our affairs? Make her stop." Vorlag jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. I will not stand here and be slandered by this creature. I demand retribution." Lycan held up a hand, and the hall fell silent again. His golden eyes were chips of ice. "You demand proof," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Very well." He turned to his beta. "Marcus, the guards?" Marcus nodded grimly. He spoke into his wrist communicator. The main doors of the council hall opened, and 2 of Lycan's personal guards were marched in, flanked by heavily armed citadel sentinels. The 2 guards were pale and sweating. They were 2 of the men who had been on duty at the restaurant. "These men," Lycan announced, "Captains Valerius and Yorick, have been loyal members of my guard for over a decade. But recently, their families have come into a great deal of unexplained wealth, new homes, expensive gifts, all paid for by anonymous benefactors." He looked at the 2 guards, his expression one of deep disappointment. "Tell the council, Captain Valerius, who was your benefactor?" The guard fell to his knees, his head bowed. "It was the Queen," he choked out, the words torn from him. She promised us wealth and status. She told us to stand down when the king collapsed. She said it was for the good of the kingdom, that the king was no longer fit to rule. A wave of shock and horror swept through the room. The confession from one of their own was damning. Seraphina stared at the kneeling guard, her face a mask of pure hatred. "You weak, pathetic fool," she hissed. "I should have had you killed." The admission, spat out in a moment of pure, uncontrolled fury, sealed her fate. She had confessed. The entire council heard it. Forlag looked like he was about to be sick. His ally had just implicated herself beyond any hope of denial. He tried to backpedal. "I knew nothing of this. The queen deceived me as well. Silence!" Lycan roared, and the force of his voice, his alpha command, shook the very stones of the hall. Vorlag clamped his mouth shut, his eyes wide with terror. Lycan walked down from his throne, his movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing with menace. He stopped in front of Seraphina, who stood frozen, her world collapsing around her. He looked down at the woman who had been his wife, his mate, and he felt nothing but a cold, empty void where his love for her used to be. "You have betrayed your king," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper for her ears only. "You have betrayed your kingdom. You have betrayed your mate bond. You are nothing." He then raised his voice for all to hear. "Seraphina of the Silver Moon Pack, for the crime of high treason and attempted regicide, I hereby strip you of your title as queen. I sever the mate bond between us." He raised his hand and made a sharp, cutting gesture in the air. On Seraphina's finger, the royal signet ring, the symbol of their bond, cracked and fell to the floor in 2 pieces. She cried out, a sound of agony, as the spiritual connection between them was violently torn apart. "You are exiled from these lands," Lycan decreed, his judgment absolute. "You will be taken to the Barren Isles, where you will live out the rest of your pathetic, ambitious life in solitude. Your name will be struck from the royal records. It will be as if you never existed." He turned his cold gaze on Lord Vorlag. "As for you, your lands and titles are forfeit to the crown. You will spend the rest of your days in the Citadel's deepest prison cell. Let this be a warning to any who would dare to threaten this throne." Justice had been delivered. It was swift, brutal, and absolute. Seraphina, no longer a queen, just a woman broken and defeated, was dragged away by the guards, her final hateful glare directed not at Lycan, but at Anna, the quiet waitress, who had brought her entire world crashing down. The public reveal was complete. The traitors were exposed. The kingdom was safe. And Anna stood in the center of it all, the unlikely catalyst for the fall of a queen and the salvation of a king.